Welcome, students. This is an online mock trial tutorial sponsored by the Mock Trial Committee of the Arkansas Bar Association and the Arkansas chapter of the American Board of Trial Advocates. The title of this tutorial is Case Themes, What They Are, and How to Use Them. My name is Jordan B. Tinsley. I am a former chair of the Mock Trial Committee of the Arkansas Bar Association, and I am a partner at a law firm in Little Rock, Arkansas called Tinsley and Youngdahl PLLC, and all of my contact information is on this slide here. If you have any questions about any of the information that you get in this presentation, I hope you'll feel free to contact me, and I'll be happy to take some time to talk to you about your questions or concerns about the content of this lecture. I need to, just like you guys, when you're writing research papers, I need to give credit to my sources. For this presentation, a lot of the material that I'm going to be presenting to you comes from a very, very qualified source. She is a PhD. Her name is Amy Singer. You can see a lot of her qualifications on this slide, but she's a private trial consultant who is a nationally recognized expert in the psychology of jurors and juries. She has a company that she has founded that assists trial attorneys with trial preparation, particularly by emphasizing what the jury's going to do with a particular case. She's also routinely on television talking about, national prominent criminal defense cases and things like that. And I've included a link to her website at the bottom of this slide. If you're interested in any of the ideas or information that you encounter here today and you want to get more information, I would encourage you to go visit her website. There's just a wealth of data and resources on her website that would also be very helpful to you if you're interested in this subject. What's interesting about Ms. Singer's work is that she has actually proven this stuff scientifically because she's a psychologist and she engages in studies of juror behavior to actually validate the theories and ideas that she holds. And so she has done that for over 3 decades, and there's sort of 4 main ideas that have emerged from her research that I want to emphasize so that you will understand the importance of case themes, because they are extremely important. So the first thing that you need to understand is that jurors actually deliberate in themes. And what that means is when the jurors go back into the private room where they meet as a group and talk about the case and decide what their verdict is going to be, they discuss the case and they think about the case through the themes that the attorneys and the advocates that have been talking to them about the case utilized. And so the second point, and this is obviously related, is that the case theme is the primary mental organizer that helps the jurors remember the facts. Sometimes you have a long trial and you hear something on the first day of a 3-week trial, and you might remember that, you might not, because the human brain is a tricky thing. Well, if the theme is properly done, the theme is going to help the jurors remember the facts that support that theme. So it actually is a memory aid, and it operates in that fashion. It also, as I've said, is a mental organizer, and so that also means that the theme not only can cause a juror to remember certain facts, it can actually cause a juror to disregard other facts that don't fit the theme. So the third main point that Ms. Singer has shown, or Dr. Singer has shown, is that a good theme enables the jurors to look for evidence that fits the theme, and then it also encourages them to disregard evidence that does not fit the theme. So if you have a bad fact in your case and you don't want the jurors to emphasize that fact, you can target your theme in such a way that you accomplish that sort of from the beginning. And so The fourth thing, which is really kind of a summation of everything we've already talked about, is that case themes facilitate evidence comprehension and enable juries to reach pre-deliberation verdict decisions. And so what that means is that when the jurors arrive in the room to begin their deliberations about the verdict that they are going to offer, those jurors are already thinking about the case through the themes that the trial advocates that they've been watching presented to them over the course of the trial. And in fact, depending upon which theme they prefer, they probably have a preformed idea about how they want to vote, what verdict they want to render based upon their preference for one side's theme or the other. So all of this, as I've said, is scientifically validated by psychological studies, and that's why I think it's so vastly important in trial advocacy. So you have to understand that the jury is actually using the theme that you give them, okay? The theme helps the jury to process the evidence in basically two ways. The first way that it helps the jury to process the evidence is that it helps the jury to organize the evidence. So as I said, what fits the theme? What doesn't fit the theme? Are there facts that are immaterial or irrelevant because of the theme? Can they just overlook those facts? Can they completely disregard certain facts because they do not fit the theme? So the theme is helping the jury organize the facts in their minds as they hear the evidence in the case. In addition to that, and this may be even more important than that, the theme is helping the jury to characterize the facts. So there are going to be some facts that you just simply cannot disregard, and the manner in which the jury interprets those facts is going to be of the utmost importance. And so at the same time that they are thinking about facts that they can disregard because they do not fit the theme, they are also thinking about facts that they can interpret in a certain way that may be more favorable to one side or the other because that's more consistent with the theme. And so the question is, how will certain facts look viewed through the lens of a particular theme? And that's what you have to kind of think about as you develop a theme and decide upon the appropriate theme for a case is, how are all these facts going to look through that lens? Okay, so now I'm going to go through certain attributes that make a good theme, and there are several of these, and these aren't listed in any necessary order of importance because they're really all important, okay? So to have a good theme, you pretty much have to check all of these boxes. All right, so the first thing I want to emphasize is that brevity is of the utmost importance. You've got to have a theme that you can deliver in a few words or less, or even just one word, okay? And so it's got to be easy to explain, it's got to be easy to understand, and if you can't say it in 30 seconds or less, it's not a good theme, just because it's not easily delivered and easily deciphered. Okay, so the next thing is that it's got to be memorable, okay? And this is a whole can of worms. There's all kinds of scientific research and studies about what makes something memorable, okay? And you can go down, into the rabbit hole of all of this scholarly research about how memory operates, and you could probably spend a lot of time looking into that. But what I would encourage you to do is to think about the things that stick in your own mind, okay? So things like movie taglines or advertising jingles where you hear it on the radio or you see it on a poster, and then 4 or 5 days later, for some reason, that's just popping in your mind. It's memorable. Why is that? When that happens to you in your life, and it happens to all of us, if you want to understand what makes a good theme, just think about, what are the attributes of these little things that I can't get out of my mind that make them so memorable. And so, I'll offer a couple of examples. I may date myself with these examples because these are old movies, but one line that I'll never forget from a movie is from a movie called The Terminator, and it's when Arnold Schwarzenegger is playing this robot from the future that is just going to destroy a police station in LA, and he comes in and they won't let him go into the police station, and he says, "I'll be back." Right? And everybody remembers that line. It kind of made Arnold Schwarzenegger famous, But what is it about that line that was so memorable? I would say that it's foreshadowing, because he says, "I'll be back," and then sure enough, he comes back and he levels the building and sets the whole place on fire and kills a bunch of people. And that's very memorable, right? And it's also just that the amount of, I guess, malevolence and evil that is coming off of him when he says, "I'll be back," is palpable. And so that's visceral, and you experience that, and it's stuck in your brain forever. Another movie line that, again, I think sticks in your mind is this line from a great movie called The Princess Bride, where there's a character who is fixated on obtaining revenge upon the person who killed his father. And so throughout the movie, he tells people, if I ever find the six-fingered man, I'm going to tell him this line. And he says, "My name is Inigo Montoya. You killed my father. Prepare to die." And so we hear that line throughout the movie, and it becomes a part of the development of that character, because that character is so fixated upon that vengeance. And I think that's what it is about that line that is so memorable, because it delivers to us in this very neatly packaged way that this is what Inigo Montoya is all about. His whole life is about finding the six-fingered man and delivering this line to him and then killing him, to get revenge for him having killed his father. So, I would encourage you to think about things like that, and obviously the movies that you're going to be thinking about are going to be much more recent than the ones that I've just talked about. But, think about what makes certain lines from films or from songs or from commercials or whatever it is that you're experiencing through popular culture, what makes that memorable, and then try to adopt some of those attributes into the themes that you utilize yourself. Two other things that your theme has to do in order for it to be a good theme are that it's got to be consistent with the facts and the evidence in the case. So, that might be obvious, but you can't put a square peg into a round hole, right? You cannot utilize a theme that just doesn't fit with the facts that the jury is going to be confronting, because the jury is not going to prefer that theme over the other side's theme. So you have to give them a theme that fits the case, and you've got to give some thought to that. Another thing is that the theme has to be consistent with the jurors' beliefs and the jurors' common sense as well, because if you have a theme that runs against the grain of someone's common sense, they're going to reject it immediately. I mean, if your theme runs counter to long-held beliefs and traditions that they have, they're just not going to accept it, and you'll be talking to a deaf audience for your whole trial. So you've got to have a theme that resonates with the jurors. So let's talk about this in a little more detail. So what you want to do with your theme is you want to identify shared values, okay? You want to create a sense of shared value between the attorney, okay? And by proxy, the attorney is standing in for his or her client, okay? And so you have to create a sense of shared values between the attorney and the jury, okay? But what that really is doing is creating some identification between the attorney's client and the jury. So a good theme is really kind of an extrapolation of a common life experience that's going to find resonance in the jurors' minds, okay? And I've got this quote in my slides from Herman Melville. He says in Moby Dick, "To produce a mighty book, you must choose a mighty theme. No great and enduring volume can ever be written on the flea." all right? So you've got, even if you have a very mundane case, right? It's just kind of some contract dispute over who owes who money. You have to elevate that, right? You have to take that very mundane kind of daily dispute and elevate the importance of it so that you've got a mighty theme and you are invoking, beliefs and values that the jury is going to share with you. So you can't just be flippant and dismissive about who owes who money. That's a big deal, and you've got to make it feel like a big deal through the choice of your theme. So as you're thinking about shared values, I want to introduce a psychological concept that Dr. Singer has written about, which is called correspondence bias. Okay? And correspondence bias is something that you absolutely want to avoid when you are trying to evoke this sense of shared values through your theme. And what correspondence bias is it's a psychological concept which says, basically that people perceive things differently, right? So you can't assume that every person out there in the world is going to see everything exactly the way that you do. And so if you're trying to evoke a sense of shared values, you have to make sure that those are actually values that everyone shares. A good example of this, I would say, is that some people, when they think of a dog, they think of a sweet little gentle pet that maybe they spent time with at their grandma's house. Other people, when they think of a dog, they get terrified because maybe they were bit by a dog when they were a kid, or maybe the dog chased them around when they were a mailman for 30 years or whatever. Everyone doesn't perceive a dog as a benevolent thing. And so you have to think about things when you're working on a theme and say, is this really going to be accepted and believed by everyone and perceived in the same way? Because if it's not, if it's kind of a controversial concept, you may want to move on to something else. Another thing that I think is important as you're trying to evoke this sense of shared values is to avoid what lawyers call legalese, okay? Legalese are legal terms, Latin phrases, big words, dictionary words. You don't want to use those. When you're talking to a jury and you're trying to invoke the juror's sense of shared values, you don't want to harp on someone's negligence. We don't talk about that in our everyday lives, okay? I'm not telling my kid, look both ways when you cross the street, otherwise you'll be negligent. No, that's not how we talk to each other. I say, hey kid, safety first. Look both ways when you cross the street. So think about that too. Can you unpack these legal terms and utilize common language that everybody's going to understand and that's going to resonate with everybody? So remember that example of negligence versus safety first, which is something that we all probably heard in daycare. Other things that you can do to find a good theme are, you want to evoke common imagery and common beliefs. And I'm just going to offer a couple of examples. These are just cultural examples. I don't want to express any preference for any particular culture or anything like that, but these are things that appear in our culture commonly that people are probably going to interpret and experience similarly. So like Shakespeare, okay? All kinds of stuff from Shakespeare plays has now been imported into our regular cultural belief system, and it's there. So, you've got things like et tu, Brute, which is what Julius Caesar said to his friend Brutus as he stabbed him in the play, in history too. But, that evokes this sense of betrayal probably to everyone. When you say et tu, Brute, everybody's going to understand that there's some kind of betrayal happening. You've also got the pound of flesh, which is a phrase used in a Shakespeare play called Merchant of Venice. That can be utilized in legal contexts all the time, particularly if you're talking about somebody who's being punished too harshly, right? You might say somebody's just after their pound of flesh, right? Other good example, and again, I'm not expressing a preference for any particular belief system, but the Bible is prominent in our culture, and there's a lot of, stories in the Bible that can provide good fodder for themes, like 2 by 2 from the story of Noah could be a good theme for someone who's following the leader. Maybe that's your defense, that they were just acting based upon what the person in front of them was doing, and so that's your theme. The story of Samson, the guy who had the long hair, who let it get cut off, that is a good potential theme for a case where someone was kind of deceived by another into doing something they weren't supposed to do. The 7 deadly sins often provide a really good starting point for developing a theme. I mean, if you can hang one of the 7 deadly sins on a plaintiff or on a defendant, you're feeling pretty good. Another thing that you need to do with this sense of shared values is that you want to try to get the jury to value themselves. You want to make the jury feel good, and you want the jury to feel important, and you want your theme to do that. And so you might say something like, if this is a criminal case, you might say, ladies and gentlemen, you are the last bulwark of freedom available to my client, because you are the only thing standing between my client and spending the rest of his life in prison, right? That makes the jury understand they've got an important job. They need to pay attention. They need to listen. They need to really think hard about what's happening in the case. And so the theme should also be motivating to the jury. It should motivate the jurors to do 2 things. First, to care about the case, okay? And by care about the case, I mean care about your client. Care about what happened to your client. Care about what's going to happen to your client, right? In addition to that, it needs to motivate the jury to want to act, okay? Because the jury does get to take some action. By rendering a verdict, they can say, you broke the law, you have to go to prison. Or they can say, you did something bad to somebody, you have to pay a bunch of damages to that person and make them whole for what you did to them. So you're motivating the jury to take some action, and you want them to take the action that your client wants. And so overall, what are you trying to do with your theme? You are trying to find a theme that is going to make the jurors identify with your client. When they look at the case and they step back and they analyze the case, you want them to do so from your client's perspective. You want them to step into the shoes of your client and say, this person experienced all this stuff, and that's the same way I'm experiencing it, and I want to make it right for them. All right? So a good theme, fundamentally, is a theme that makes the jury identify with your client and motivates the jury to take the action that your client wants. Okay, so in a minute, I'm going to talk about some mnemonic devices that you can use, because we're talking about what makes things memorable, how does memory operate, and I think mnemonic devices are really helpful. You've probably utilized them when you're studying for tests, but you take a word and you just think of different other words that start with the letters in that word. So we've got the word theme here, and I've got, several different attributes of a theme so that you can help remember as you think about what is a good theme. It needs to be these 5 things. So it needs to be targeted, all right? It's got to be targeted at your toughest jurors, and it's got to be targeted at your toughest facts. Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to give the jury a mental organizer that it can use to process the evidence. And you don't want the low-hanging fruit to grab onto that theme, because they're probably going to process the evidence the way you want in the first place. So you have to think about, what theme can I give a bad juror, a juror that I think is very far away from my client, that will have a hard time identifying with my client? What theme can I give them to help bridge that gap, to help them get closer to identifying with my client? So you have to target your theme at your toughest jurors and at your toughest facts. In addition, the theme has got to be holistic. Okay, it can't just incorporate one little piece of the case. It has to incorporate every aspect of the case, and it has to offer a means of explaining the whole case. Okay, so if your theme only decides a piece of the case, it's not enough. It's not holistic. Go back to the drawing board and get a more comprehensive theme. Your theme also has to be economical, and I mean that in the sense of word economy. Okay, so you want your entire case summed up as briefly as possible, and that's your theme. Okay, again, it's got to be memorable. That's why we're doing this mnemonic device. In a second, we're going to talk about more traditional mnemonic devices that you can potentially utilize to get a memorable theme. In addition, it has got to be easy. Okay, that's the last E. It's got to be effortless to say. It's got to be effortless to repeat. It has to be natural. It should flow off your tongue, okay? Because you need to repeat it. And we will talk about why repetition aids in memory, but it does. You know, the more often that you hear something and the more often that you hear it in certain contexts, the more likely you are to remember it. And so as we will discuss, your theme is going to be repeated throughout your case, and thus it has to be easy to say. So I promised you that we were going to talk about some traditional mnemonic devices, and here are three that I think are really important when you're thinking about case themes. So the first is alliteration, and that's the repetition of sounds at the beginning of words. Okay, so if you can have a string of words that all start with the same sound, research indicates that it's easier for people to remember that type of alliterative phrase. You can also utilize a device called assonance. Assonance is the repetition of vowel sounds within words. So if you have a string of words that all utilize the same vowel sounds, research indicates that people are more likely to remember that. Finally, and a lot of people maybe don't realize that this is a mnemonic device, but metaphor is a mnemonic device. Now, you don't want to use metaphors with which people are completely unfamiliar, obviously, and this goes back to evoking a sense of shared values, and so you have to be careful what kind of metaphors you utilize, but a metaphor can be a very powerful memory aid. And in addition to that, I would say don't be too heavy-handed when it comes to metaphors, and we'll talk about sort of the importance of understatement as we go on. But those are three mnemonic devices that I want you to think about as you think about what makes things memorable. So what should the theme do? The theme should act as a laser beam of meaning and significance to illuminate and clarify the case and make it understandable for the jurors. I stole that from Dr. Singer. I think it's a great line, and it makes a ton of sense because literally this is like something that you're shooting into the juror's brain to try to help them understand the case. It's like osmosis, laser beam into the juror's brain, and it illuminates the case. So the theme helps the jurors focus on a key idea or concept that is essential to a favorable disposition of the case for your client. And so we've been talking about metaphors, and so I want you to think about the theme as operating like three different things, okay? And the first is a lens, and I think we've talked about this before because the theme is what the jurors view the case through. It's like a pair of reading glasses that you put on and suddenly, the words make sense, right? Also, you've got different kinds of lenses, and so some lenses make what's in the foreground look clear and make what's in the background look muddy, right? Other lenses do it different. Other lenses take what's in the background and clarify that and make the foreground look muddy. And so that's what you need to conceptualize when you think about how a theme is operating, because when you put on that theme, when you look through that lens, certain facts get muddy and certain facts gain clarity. okay? And that's what I want you to think about when you conceptualize a theme as a lens. Another thing that I think you can analogize the theme to is an anchor, okay? You're out in the middle of the ocean. You know, the ocean is all the facts of the case, swimming around you like a bunch of sharks, okay? Well, you drop your anchor, all right? You drop your anchor out there in the ocean, and that is where you start from, okay? And then you just start circling around that anchor. That anchor's heavy. It pulls you back to the center of that case, and it's got a gravitational pull. So as you're exploring that case, as you're sailing around that ocean of facts, you never get too far away from this heavy anchor right in the middle of the case. And so that's another thing that I want you to think about as you think about how the theme operates. It pulls the jurors back to certain central facts or ideas. It has like a gravitational pull. It's heavy, right? Another thing that I want you to think about, and this goes back to psychology and Dr. Singer's background, is that the anchor is like a cue. Okay, like if you're in a play, you know, you hear your cue and you have to come out and do your little dance number, right? There's also this psychologist named Pavlov who did a study where he had a dog, and every time he would feed the dog, he would ring a bell, okay? And he did that for days and days and days, feed the dog, ring the bell at the same time. And eventually, he stopped feeding the dog at the same time that he rang the bell, and whenever he would ring the bell, the dog would salivate because it would get hungry because it was associating the bell with feeding time. And that's the same way that the theme can operate as a cue, because the theme is the bell in the Pavlov example, okay? When you ring that bell, it triggers certain emotions and feelings inside the minds of the jurors. And so, you know, when you think of the theme as a cue, I want you to think of it as like that Pavlovian bell that is out there ringing, and as that bell rings, the jurors suddenly realize, oh man, I'm starving, right? How do you employ themes effectively? So the next group of slides until the end of this lecture are all going to be about different techniques for utilizing a good case theme once you've decided on them. So, you know, the stuff before this is all about what makes a good theme, and now this stuff following this is about how do you use a good theme once you've got it, right? The first technique and the most important technique for that is called enveloping the theme, okay? And that's a phrase that I've stolen from Dr. Singer, but what that means is that you have to integrate the theme into every aspect of the attorney's presentation. So that includes opening statement, that includes direct examination, that includes cross-examination, that includes closing argument. Every aspect of the case, you have got to have your anchor somewhere in that part of your presentation. So a good example, and we've already talked about this legalese concept, which is negligence, okay? Somebody is not being safety conscious, and as a result of that, somebody gets injured. That's negligence, okay? So a theme that you often see in negligence cases that plaintiffs' attorneys utilize is the theme of prevention, okay? It's just one word, prevention. Because what they're saying is somebody got hurt and they shouldn't have, okay? It should have been prevented. If somebody had been paying attention, if somebody had not been negligent, if they had been safety first, they would have prevented this injury. So the theme here is prevention. All right, so if you're enveloping the prevention theme in a negligence case, in your opening statement, you might ask the rhetorical question, could this defendant have prevented the injury that my client suffered? Okay, you ask that rhetorical question in your opening. All right, and you do that within the first 30 seconds of your opening because, you know, that's when you have to get your theme out. Then in direct examination, you call your first witness and you have that witness come up, and let's say this witness is the inspector who looked at, you know, the unsafe conditions where your client got injured, and you say, Inspector, what different steps could this defendant have taken to prevent this injury that my client suffered? So there's your theme again. So then, later on, the defendant has called up one of their witnesses, and it's your turn to cross-examine that witness. And you go to that witness and you say, how many injuries would have been prevented if you had just done these couple of things that you needed to do? And then they'll say, oh, it's impossible to know how many injuries we could have prevented. But you keep hammering that idea. Then you get up in your closing argument and you say, ladies and gentlemen, this has been a long trial, and you've heard a lot of evidence, but not one single time has the defendant described a step that it took to prevent this injury, and now my client's in a wheelchair for the rest of his life. Okay, so you enveloped that prevention theme and integrated that into every aspect of your case. Another thing that you've got to think about in this process of enveloping is objections, okay? And a lot of people think that objections are great. You just want to constantly object. If there's anything objectionable, object, right? But you have to understand that jurors do not like objections. Why? They want to know. They want to know what's being objected to. They would rather have more facts than less facts, okay? So they don't want evidence excluded. They want to be able to consider all the evidence. So when somebody gets up and says, Your Honor, I object, the jurors begin to speculate about what it is that they're not going to be able to hear, okay? So you also have to think about your theme as you think about what you should and should not object to. Because if you object to something that you'd rather have in the case because it helps your theme, you've shot yourself in the foot. At the same time, if you object to something and call attention to it and get the jurors' minds working over what that could possibly be, you might have done some damage to your case as well. So remember, don't just object for the sake of objecting. Keep your theme in mind when you think about when it is and is not appropriate to object. Okay, so some other techniques that we want to talk about. We want to talk about analogies and metaphors. Okay, so let's go back to this prevention case. You could say whatever it is that the defendant did that hurt my client, it's just like leaving a patch of ice on a sidewalk that people walk on all the time. It's just that dangerous. Okay? Because, most people have almost slipped and cracked their head open on some ice before. That's going to resonate with the juror far more than, they didn't install a control on a piece of machinery or something, So you want to try to analogize the defendant's misconduct to something that is more closely related to the lives of the jurors. Another good technique for utilizing your theme is to ask rhetorical questions. And, this is something that I kind of talked about when we were talking about enveloping. You can use rhetorical questions in your opening argument and closing argument. And what this does is it introduces a counter-attitudinal message, and it leads to more intensive processing of the message because the jurors begin to ask themselves questions, right? So it makes the jurors begin to think more. It gets their thought processes moving much more so than just taking prepackaged ideas from the advocate. They begin to try to fill in the blanks and answer those rhetorical questions. And what is the beauty of a rhetorical question? A rhetorical question suggests its own answer, right? So they don't have to think very long about what the answer is to the rhetorical question, but because they arrived at it themselves, they feel better about it and they take ownership of that idea. A similar idea is what we call expectancy statements, okay? So you could say to the juror, you can expect us to show that this injury could have been prevented, right? And then that way you get the jurors to kind of anticipate evidence, and they're waiting for it, and then they're huddled up on the edge of their seats waiting for you to show them how the injury could have been prevented. And so, this has an effect upon the jurors' processing of the evidence because when they finally hear that evidence, they are so keyed up and tuned into it that maybe they forget some other stuff that they've already heard. Another thing that you can utilize to try to emphasize your theme in various ways is to utilize visual aids. Okay, if you have a visual aid that you think makes your theme better, use it, You can utilize pictures, you can utilize objects. I mean, if you have a particular weapon that has played a role and that somehow assists your theme, show that to the jurors when you talk about your theme, because they're going to associate that weapon with what you're saying, just like that Pavlovian bell. You can also utilize what's called parallelism, and this is sort of like those other mnemonic devices that I talked about, where you can say the injury to my client was preventable because it was avoidable. It was avoidable because it was foreseeable. And I've found that using that kind of parallel language where you create kind of a chain of ideas, that can help the jury to kind of unpack some of those legal concepts that we've been talking about, like negligence. Another concept that I think is really useful is what we call the rule of three. And again, this is scientifically validated. I mean, there are studies in communications research that show that we remember things better when we hear it 3 times. Okay, so using this prevention theme, you could get up in your opening and you could say, prevention, prevention, prevention. If only the defendants had thought about that, we wouldn't be here today, right? And that's your rule of 3. And the jurors, when they remember your opening, what are they going to remember? Prevention, right? Okay, so now I want to talk about understatement. And we've talked about this a little bit, but what I want you to try to understand is that you want the jurors' minds to work, okay? You want the jurors to imagine these things, okay? Because that's going to have a greater impact on them viscerally than just hearing it from you. You want them to think about what it was like when the plaintiff got hurt, okay? So a good example of this, there's this quote where people were talking about a radio show done by this director called Orson Welles, and they said, the horror in the imagination is worse than in reality. And what they were talking about is Orson Welles had done a radio show that was based upon a novel called The War of the Worlds, and he broadcast this radio show as if these aliens were actually invading the earth. And so he's just saying, oh, we've spotted UFOs over several parts of New York, blah, blah, blah. There are these humanoid aliens coming off the ships, and people all over the country, they thought it was real, and they were freaking out, And so that's because he really utilized this understatement process and got these people to imagine that there are actually aliens visiting the earth, and it made a massive impact culturally. So a really, really good example of this understatement idea that I think is very resonant is a case from Chicago. And this is an old case. This was back when, there was a lot of problems in the meat packing industry. And there was a guy who got injured in a meat packing accident at a factory. And what happened is he was pulled into a machine, and the machine crushed both of his arms, and both of his arms had to be amputated. And his lawyer sued the company that he worked for, and they were arguing, he's been severely damaged and he needs to be compensated for these injuries. And so the lawyer gets up to give his closing argument, and just by luck, the closing argument happened right after lunch. And he says, I see the defendant over here. The defendant's the president of the corporation that injured my client, and he's laughing with his attorneys and having a good time. And I bet they had a good time at lunch. I bet they went to a nice place and probably had some good lunch, and everybody really enjoyed that. And he says, I have to say, I went out to lunch with my client, and it was not enjoyable. You want to know why? It's because my client eats like a dog. And then he sat down. That was his whole his whole closing statement, was just saying, my client eats like a dog for the rest of his life. And that was literally the largest civil verdict that was awarded prior to that case in the city of Chicago ever. And he got that award just by making the jurors imagine what it's like for this man to have to eat like a dog for the rest of his life, And he did that through the power of understatement. So Again, we've talked about this. You want to aim your theme toward the toughest audience on the jury. You want to engage the skeptical jurors, because the jurors that already identify with your client don't need a good theme to do so, right? So remember that as you're utilizing the theme. So, when you say your theme at some point, maybe look at one juror in particular that you're targeting, because that's your tough juror. Another thing that I want you to think about as you're thinking about how to utilize themes is that I want you to try to comment on the use of power by the different parties in the case, because that's something that jurors are constantly assessing. They're assessing what is the relative power dynamics of the parties, and they're also assessing whether or not the parties used the power that they had in a responsible way. And so, if you can emphasize that a particular party is an underdog, or you can play up kind of the David and Goliath story, or you can show that, somebody was not responsible with the power that they've been given, that's a good way to utilize a theme. Another way to use a theme is just with clever language, and the best example is Johnny Cochran in the O.J. case saying, if the glove doesn't fit, you must acquit. Those two words rhyme, and, people think that that's such a silly thing to hang a case on, but you know what? It worked. O.J. Simpson got acquitted because that glove didn't fit. That's probably not the only reason, but whenever anybody thinks about that case, I guarantee you they remember that phrase. A couple other psychological ideas that you've got to think about. First is this idea of primacy. Okay, so this is a scientifically validated concept which says jurors are going to place the greatest emphasis on information that they receive first, because that's the way memory works. If you hear something early, you're more likely to remember it. So that's why you've got to get that theme out in the first 30 seconds of your opening statement. Another concept that you've got to remember is this concept of recency, okay? And this is a psychological concept which says that people also are more inclined to remember things that they hear at the end, okay? So you want to end with some strong evidence. And I don't care whether we're talking about a cross-examination or whether we're talking about your closing argument. You've got to save a little bit of meat, keep a little bit of meat on the bone for the end so that the jurors will remember that. And so, remember the difference between primacy and recency, okay? So primacy is saying the things they hear first they're going to remember, and you've got to, utilize that because you want them to remember a particular belief system. So you got to give them that laser beam in the first 30 seconds so that then they're using that lens and that anchor and that cue to unpack the case all the way through the trial. And then recency, if you tell them very, very late in the case, these are the couple little things that I want you to remember and emphasize, they're more likely to do that. And then we've already talked about repetition, and I want to repeat what I've said about repetition because that's important. That's why we remember things. If you've got a good theme, you want to repeat it as often as you can and as often as it's appropriate. And I'd say a good example of that is the I Have a Dream speech by Martin Luther King. Everybody's heard that speech. Everybody remembers those 4 words, I have a dream. And that speech was very effective because it was just built upon the repetition of those words. The last thing that I want to talk about, and this is something that's very difficult to do sometimes because particularly in mock trial, it changes from every round to every round. But if you can find a way to reverse your opponent's theme, I think that is a really, really effective technique because it takes their theme and it just kind of implodes it, because you've taken their theme and you've turned it to your own ends, and now their theme is your theme. And what Dr. Singer calls that is thematic reversal. And so you just think about your opponent's theme, and they give their opening statement, you figure out what their theme is, and for the rest of the trial, you're trying to figure out what can I say in my closing to reverse their theme on them and just implode this whole structure of meaning that they've been building for the whole trial. And if you're able to do that, then you can just do away with all of this stuff that I've been talking about in one fell swoop. And, the jury is obviously going to prefer your theme to your opponent's theme because you just swept the rug right out from under them. So that's the last thing that I want you to think about, and you need to think about that as you develop your theme as well, because you want to make sure that your theme is not susceptible to that kind of reversal. So if you're sitting there thinking about a theme and you're like, oh, this is a great theme, and then your teammate is like, well, if I was against you in that round, I would say this. And then you're like, ooh, that's pretty good. That reverses that theme. You might want to go back to the drawing board and find a different theme that's harder to reverse, because the little sandcastle that you've been building throughout the trial can be washed away just that quick if somebody, takes the wind out of your sails on your theme. So themes are very important. I hope you guys have learned a little bit about themes, and I wish you best of luck in your competition.